Willkommen. This is the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Germany. It was built somewhere around 1790. Was closed off, obviously, for 30 years during the Cold War and was reopened in 1990. And to prove that it's there and that I was there, here are photographs of the scene. It was a very dramatic moment in the life of many, many people in Germany when I was there. This is part of a collection of cardboard models that I have built and are now presenting as the German and related section. I will identify the other collections of Christmas greetings at the end of the program. The next in our series of 2025 models in Germany and related territory, preserved just for the sheer medieval beauty of it. It's charming. It's not necessarily a pure indication of a village, but there is a jousting match down along the shorefront, and nearby a boat pulling a load along probably the Danube River. There is a series of these particular made models that are not uniquely identified, but are part of a tradition of preserving medieval structures in Germany. Here we have a similar tradition of architecture portrayed by the same ultimate designer, but it has a feeling of 19th, 18th century structure and community, and is part of a collection of similar buildings. All right, we have here a delightful combination of architecture and model making in a square. And as you can see, they built the entire town of Rothenburg inside these squares. And they portray the town as it was in the 18th, 19th century. It was, however, the custom at that time to have the hospital outside of the town because of the fear of pestilence and trouble. So the hospital itself for Rothenburg is really a totally different building of rather charming design just outside the center of town between Frankfurt and Hamburg. They are preserved in Germany as part of the heritage and the attraction of the countryside and are regular tourist sites. Our next model is Hoheneck, and by itself, historically, it is not of great importance, but the creation of collector models of buildings and villages in Germany is very common. We rarely see this custom in America, but in Europe, most major structures have been rendered as models. And obviously, it is the tower where the money was sequestered, and these would have been residential towers. There are usually dozens of different castles that are to be shown or sold throughout Germany. This is Schloss Rapperswil, and it, like so many castles in Europe, was on a stream. So I have fabricated a moat along the edge of the castle. Obviously, by tradition, the funds, the wealth of the castle was in the tower. If you look down inside here, you will see the wooden walk of the interior of the second floor, and that is just characteristic of the design. There are simply hundreds and hundreds of castles throughout Germany and its neighbors. We are wandering abroad just ever so little by going to Switzerland to see the castle of Tyburg. It was started in 1300s and was continuously occupied since. It has obviously the core building and the tower that almost all castles had at that time. Other than that, it's part of a large series of castles throughout Europe. Here we have one of the most beautiful gates of all Europe. It is the city gate of the city of Basel in Switzerland. And it just is, by itself, it is very handsome. It was built around 1300 and is still obviously in full use. It doesn't allow for very many 18-wheelers, but it certainly has the beauty for visitors. We're wandering a little bit afield to look at the royal castle of Liechtenstein. It's called Vaduz, and it was built in the 13th century and has been privately occupied ever since. It is not, like so many others, a public building to be visited. The royal family of Liechtenstein still lives there. And so it has a charm of its own, but it is a private residence. You can imagine living and playing in the yards of Vaduz. Again, with a little liberal interpretation of European castles related to Germany, this is the royal castle in Warsaw, Poland. And It is in fine shape today, but the story of it is much more impressive. Potemkin was a young man engaged by Catherine II of Russia, and she entertained young men for just so long and then passed them along. And over her life, she never had a husband, but she did have 12 lovers. Potemkin was the first. And when his time was completed with the Empress, she gave him a piece of land, which may have been down in the lower part of Russia or Ukraine. At any rate, she announced a few years later that she intended to visit, and this was horrendous because he was expected to have a fully furnished, fully occupied part of the country of his own, and that just hadn't happened. So he created what have been known and what we saw in Warsaw as Potemkin villages. And a Potemkin village is a facade, but only 2x4s behind it to hold the facade up. So when Catherine went for her royal visit, she was able to see what looked like buildings and facades and windows and doors and people dancing in the street. But in truth be known, there was nothing there behind it. This is of significance because the same applied when we, as the University Greek Club of New York City, visited Warsaw. They were still recovering from World War II, and there were a number of places where the facade of the building had been erected and looked like the building was working, but truth be known, there was no building behind it at all. It is a term now, I guess, in the architectural field that fake buildings are Potemkin buildings. This is back in Germany. This is a vision of Dresden. And you'll see that the structure, the design of the model is very much like some we've seen earlier. It's very clever and very difficult to design, but charming way to present the view of the city of Dresden. I'm not sure how many cities have been covered this way, but certainly it gives a first taste of what Dresden looks like. This is the magnificent Dresden Opera House, one of the major concert halls of Europe. And I attended here after World War II. I must admit they were still rebuilding from scratch. And we came up to the front door, bought tickets, and the concert was going to be splendid. But we then learned that they had not yet installed air conditioning. And so it was abysmally hot inside. So my wife Ann and I went around to the side to the bar and had a number of beers while we watched the football game. It is just a superb piece of architecture that is famous in its own right. This is a most astounding building. It is the Marienkirche, or Church of Our Lady, in Dresden, Germany. And at the end of World War II, the highest wall still standing after the bombing was only 12 feet high, about to here. It was completely demolished, as was most of the city of Dresden. I had occasion to go there to service in 2002, I believe. At any rate, what is absolutely fascinating and quite different is that it has not one floor or two or three or four or five or six, but 7 floors inside. So if you can't get a seat on the first floor, you can climb the stairs and sit on the 7th floor and attend good Lutheran service. The other aspect that was fascinating to me with the history of German independence was that their minister in charge was female. It is simply not common to think of women being the rectors of churches in Middle Europe. At any rate, we attended service there and were truly amazed that there were people visiting and attending the service way up over our heads, in addition to being a beautiful building. This is the monastery of Melk, M-E-L-K, about 50 miles west of Vienna. And it was originally built as a monastery for the Benedictine order. And then, since it's up on top of a hill, they extended the building out back, expanded the monastery, included a boys' school, and I think ultimately a girls' school. However, the church suffered rather disastrously during the Second World War. I don't think it was bombed directly, but just the shrapnel and the other degradation took the whole building down. And so after the war was over, they said, oh dear, what do we do to build our church back up again? The easy answer turned out to be they sold their Gutenberg Bible for a mere $5 million. With those dollars, they developed an entry uh, slightly different from the structure of the model, but you enter, and the combination of those dollars plus tourist dollars have now put this monastery back in business, and it is a perfectly beautiful sight to see the interior of the monastery and also the rest of the grounds. When it was being remodeled about the beginning of the 19th century, a special section was set aside as a residence for Napoleon. Unfortunately, he was too busy in other parts of Europe, and he never did make it to stay at Milk. But this is a fascinating and huge establishment not far from Vienna. My tours of Europe were mostly in the group of singers from Manhattan, but I did develop visions of grandeur. And so this is the crown of the Holy Roman Emperor, rather well encrusted with jewels. What I found, however, was that the kings of Europe, starting with Charlemagne in 800 AD, all had heads that were less big than mine. So I had to cut the crown apart in order to accommodate my long hairs. At any rate, it's a fascinating relic of European history.
I think you should put it on. Go for it.
And with that, I conclude my message for the year 2025. This is, I think, the 5th year that I have done a video of my castles that I have built. The first one was cathedrals, churches, and temples. The second one was Americana. The third year was Hail Britannica for Our Late Queen. The fourth year was Vive la France. The fifth year was St. Nicholas. Now we are doing Germany and related countries, and that is the core of my 200 models that are now assembled and collected in my barn. For the production of this, I'm obviously responsible for collecting the models and constructing them. I am grateful to my daughter, Betsy Rivinus Denny, who has shot me through all this series. And so it is her shooting and also her editing that is producing this show, with best wishes for the season.